But before I get into the PowerPoint, because I'm a consultant, I have to have a bunch of PowerPoint slides. But before I get into it, I want to share a quick story to sort of set the context for digital transformation and risk mitigation. So for those of you that don't know, again, my name's Eric. I've been married for 10 years, and I have two kids. I have two stepsons. They're both teenagers. They both play sports. One's 17 and one is 14. And September was sort of a rough month for the Kimberling household. At the beginning of September, our older son had a nagging knee injury. Didn't know what it was. It was sort of, he felt like it was a sprain or something like that. He hurt himself in football practice. And we find out he tore his ACL. So he has to, get ACL surgery in September. And he's 17, so he had been helping drive and helping. We certainly didn't need to drive him around anymore, but now we didn't have a driver to help take our younger son around. So we're already a man down at this point. And then about less than 2 weeks later, my wife complains that she's got really sharp stomach pain. So I take her to the emergency room on a Wednesday night at like 9 o'clock. And they say, your appendix is about to burst, so you need your appendix removed. So she gets emergency appendicitis surgery. And, at first what I'm worried about is her well-being. And then you start to think, wait, who's going to take the kids to school in the morning, and who's going to take them to practice? And you start thinking about all the logistical stuff. So she's down at this point, and I'm doing a lot of the driving to get the kids to where they need to be. And then 2 days after her appendicitis, our younger son is playing in a football game, and he breaks his leg in 4 places. So he goes down. He gets emergency room treatment, and they reset his leg, all this stuff. So then you're thinking, okay, I'm the last person standing in this family. So I've got to figure a lot of stuff out. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. And it's amazing how much stuff I don't know and didn't know as a dad. One being how much my wife does to take care of everything in the household. So it gets to the point where, what time does school start? Where's your school? What school do you go to? What grade are you in again? You start asking all these questions that the clueless dad would ask. And so there was a couple days of this, and then I started telling people. By the way, that it's been like I've been a single dad for weeks now, and my wife would remind me it's been 48 hours. But it feels like weeks. In dad years, it's been like a month that I've been having to do this. So the reason I bring all this up is that it's a lot like digital transformations, right? There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of things happening. Hopefully, in your digital transformation, people aren't dropping like flies like they are in my household. But the whole idea with digital transformation is there's a lot of risk and things happen. And so what I want to talk about today is just how to navigate risk and how to develop strategies that make sense for your organization and will help you succeed and navigate some of those risks along the way. And I think what you'll find in this session here throughout today, and those of you staying through tomorrow as well, is that there's a lot of what we're going to focus on is the good, the bad, the ugly. We're not here to sugarcoat what digital transformation should look like. We're here to talk about what they really look like and what the messiness of it is. And it's not meant to scare you or tell you or make you think that you shouldn't go through a digital transformation. Instead, it's do your digital transformation, but do it with eyes wide open. And that's really what the point here and the theme is of this entire conference, is to have that tech agnostic view of how to navigate risks, not like my family's, but using that metaphor and analogy, the risks of digital transformations. So just a real quick overview of Third Stage Consulting. For those of you that don't know, we're tech agnostic, we're independent, we're not affiliated with any software vendors. We certainly have software vendors here today. We are not affiliated with them or any other software vendors. And that's our value proposition, and that will always be the core of who we are, is our tech independence and tech agnosticism. But if that's a word, I don't think that's a word, but it is now. So that's our business model. And also the big part of what we focus on as an organization is the business and technology and the organizational components of transformation. So we're not tech consultants, I wouldn't say, but we are business consultants that help organizations through their tech initiatives. So a lot of what we focus on as an organization is not only software and application and tech related, but it's also related to process improvement, organizational change, and things of that nature. The third stage metaphor I actually stole from a rock and roll band called Boston. If you remember them from the late 70s, their third album was called Third Stage, and that whole album was a metaphor for the rocket launch idea that I stole from them. So definite rock and roll connection. Clearly, I'm a child of the 80s, which is why there's an 80s tribute band playing here later today. We work with a lot of different clients, a lot of different industries, a lot of manufacturing, distribution, food and beverage, government, financial services, some nonprofits as well. A lot of different types of organizations we work with throughout the world. We have offices in London for Europe, as well as in Australia for our Asia Pacific presence, and then also in Cape Town, South Africa for our African clients as well. So global team, global client base based here in North America, but we have team members throughout the world. My book is for sale. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today are themes that I pulled from the book here today. And so you can buy it if you want it electronically. You can scan the QR code or just go to thefinalcountdown.com. If you are also a child of the 80s, you might be picking up on this whole 80s theme here with the Final Countdown naming convention of the book. But you can buy it electronically on Amazon, or we've got hard copies for sale too, if you like, and I'll sign it for you too, if you'd like. So a lot of what we'll talk about today and the theme of this presentation is pulled from that book. So to start, I guess, let me ask you a question of the group here. How many of you are in the midst of a transformation already? You're already somewhere in the journey. Okay, maybe half of you roughly. How many of you are planning or thinking about or getting ready to start a transformation of some sort? Okay, very good. So maybe about half of you are already in the middle of it. A third of you are getting ready to start, and then the others, maybe you're not sure. And I'm curious, what are the other? What's the other category? What's the other option? But the whole reason I asked that is because digital transformation is a word that I love and hate at the same time. You know, I love it because it sounds cool and it's about technology. But on the other hand, it's so vague and broad and it has different meanings. And what does it really mean? And it's a little misleading too, because the word digital, I think, throws off the entire phrase because it gets you focused on the technology. And technology is certainly a part of it. And don't get me wrong, you're not going to do a digital transformation effectively in the long term without technology, and you're going to fall behind and you'll accumulate tech debt, all that stuff. I agree with that. But if you sort of lead with that mindset and lead with technology, that's where organizations tend to get into trouble. And part of the reason for that is because even if we do look at technology itself and focus on the technology aspect of transformation, we have to figure out, well, what is that? What does digital mean to us? What does technology mean to us? And what types of technology are going to be the best fit for us as an organization? And for some organizations, it might be that we're going to go out and we're going to find a single fully integrated ERP system. For others, it might be we're going to go do a more of a composable ERP or a best of breed where we go find multiple systems to address different needs within our organization. It could be that we're going to go deploy some sort of interoperability model. It could be that we're going to upgrade our current technologies and more incrementally move towards our journey. There's just a lot of different ways you can approach and tackle digital transformation. And there's a lot of different types of technologies you can use to enable your transformation. And so the word digital transformation is very broad, even just when we look at the technology piece of it. And then when you add on top of technology, the other components, the non-technology pieces, that's where digital transformation gets really complicated. That's where you start to incorporate the process improvements and the organizational change components of transformation. And those, in my opinion, are much more important than the technology aspect of it, the business process and the organizational side of it. And a lot of this all starts with having strategic alignment up front and understanding what it is we want to accomplish as an organization before we get too far into our transformation. What a lot of organizations do in terms of like organizational psychology that ends up happening a lot of times is that organizations will get enamored by a certain type of technology or a certain vendor, and they just put all their eggs in that basket and they go down that path without really backing up and looking at what are we really trying to do here and how could we selectively use technologies in different ways to give ourselves a competitive advantage. And I think a lot of this is because organizations just don't know, and there's a lot of options they get overwhelmed by, and that's why it's so important to really think through what it is you're trying to accomplish and be deliberate about how you're going to use technology to enable your transformation. So I want to cover a few themes from the book and also just themes of things to consider as you go through a digital transformation. And if you watch any of my YouTube videos or if you know me, a lot of times I say things that are semi-controversial or that people may not agree with. And it's also things that run counter to what the software industry has conditioned us all to think. And so being tech agnostic and independent, we don't have to worry about pissing anyone off, for lack of a better word, is because we're just here to help our clients. And so, you know, one of the things that a lot of organizations don't realize is that there is a dark side to cloud, the whole movement to cloud. And I'm not doubting that that's where we're going. We're going to the cloud, right? There's no real questioning that. I think the vendors have doubled down on it. It's where the the tech industry is going. So there's not a question of, is cloud here to stay? But I think the real question is, what are the risks behind it? And we've been sold for about 10 or 15 years now, we've been sold this idea of all the benefits of cloud. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of benefits to cloud technologies, but there is also a dark side. And those are the things that a lot of times organizations don't realize. And the reason I bring up this and other risks and other blind spots that organizations have, again, is not to scare people, but to say there's a risk over here. We've got to look and see what we're going to do about that landmine that's right there. If we don't know it's there, we don't think about it, or we ignore it, we're probably going to step in it. And so in the case of cloud technology, a couple of things that to be aware of is that a lot of times when you move to like a software as a service or a multi-tenant sort of a cloud solution, there's just a flexibility that you lose from what you might have had with your homegrown legacy system. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a fact, right? If you have this homegrown system, you've been using it for 30 years and you built it exactly how you wanted it, now you're going to move to a SaaS solution that has great functionality, might give you quantum leap improvements to your business, but you're losing some of the flexibility you had with your homegrown on-prem system. That's the risk, right? So what are we going to do about it? And that puts more pressure on the organizational change side of things, because now you're going to force your people to change more than you might change the technology. It's also going to put more pressure on your business processes, because now you've got to adapt your business to fit the software rather than the other way around. And again, that might be the right answer, and it probably is the right answer for a lot of you long term, and it might deliver the ROI to justify the risk, but we have to figure out what we're going to do to get there. How are we going to navigate the fact that we're going from this current environment we're in, now we're taking this massive leap to an entirely new technology, a new set of business processes? That's the sort of thing that organizations need to be aware of. And you really have to think through these things when you're planning for a digital strategy or a transformation and defining your strategy and roadmap for that transformation. You have to take that into account. So when a software vendor tells you that we can implement technology for you in 12 months or 6 months, whatever the number is, I have no doubt they probably can. But the question becomes, can you actually use that technology, and will it be adapted by your organization in a way that delivers business value? That's a different scenario than just deploying technology. And so we have to understand that risk and understand what that means, because what happens otherwise is we develop an unrealistic project plan, an unrealistic budget, we have unrealistic staffing and resourcing for the project, and then we get to some point in the project and realize that was never realistic to begin with, and now we're over budget, we're over time, we need to go back and ask for more money from the board. Those are kinds of conversations that are never pleasant, and they create a lot of problems. And potentially even worse, what happens is organizations start cutting stuff. They think, well, that budget was never realistic, that timeline was never realistic, we're not going to meet it. Let's cut change management. Let's cut a couple rounds of training. Let's cut a couple rounds of testing. Maybe we don't worry about cleaning up the data the way we wanted to, and you start making really bad decisions because you have to. And I'm not just talking about cloud when it comes to that, by the way. That's a dynamic you have to watch in general, because you want to be realistic about what the transformation is going to look like. And that's really the downside of cloud that we have to be aware of and that we have to be prepared for. Another thing to think about too with transformations, and this is a huge theme of the book, The Final Countdown, available for sale right out here. Shameless self-plug there. And I'll sign it for you too at no charge. There's organizational change. That is a theme you'll see throughout the entire book. It's a theme that I don't think it's possible for me to make a video or give a presentation without talking about change management. And organizational change is it's not important. It's something that's just a bare minimum ante to play the game. You have to do change management or else you will fail. One of the things that I do as a consultant, in addition running Third Stage, is I'm an expert witness in a lot of lawsuits. In fact, that's how I met Taft Law, who's been a sponsor of the event for several years now, and Marcus Harris in particular, who's sitting right here. Hi, Marcus. If you ever get sued or need to sue someone, he's the guy you want to talk to. But one thing I found in doing expert witness work for Marcus and other attorneys is that every single digital transformation failure that gets to the lawsuit stage that I've been involved with, change management was one of the core problems in the project. And what we do in these expert witness cases too, by the way, is it's like a forensic analysis of everything that went wrong, the entire car crash. You have to reconstruct what happened in this whole train wreck. You read every email that was exchanged, every status report, every PowerPoint presentation, every steering committee update. You learn all this stuff about people that you just don't want to know, because you're reading their emails and you're seeing all the weird stuff that happens in organizations at times. So it's super fascinating. I feel like I could write a fiction or a semi-fiction book about all the weird stuff that I've learned or seen in these expert witness cases. But then I'd probably get sued, so I don't want to do that. Even though I have a great attorney over there with Marcus. But the change management thing is the one thing that I'll say is the number one theme for why projects fail. And so rather than talking about how change management is important, we should all do change management, I would change the narrative a bit and say it's just an absolute minimum ante. You have to do it. If you don't do it, then just don't do your transformation. That would be my advice. If you're going to invest super heavily in technology and you're not going to invest that much in change management, or you're not willing to shift some of your dollars and focus from technology over to the people side of the equation, then I would argue you should probably just not do a transformation. In fact, you'd probably be better off just doing incremental adjustments to your technology, but getting the processes right, getting your people up to speed and optimizing what you've got. You're probably going to get a much bigger ROI from that than the risk you take on from implementing technology without investing heavily in change management. So organizational change and also human capital management, just how you manage not only the digital transformation team, but your entire organization, how you manage them through the organization or through the transformation are both very critical. Another thing we're seeing is the mainstream adoption of AI and analytics. But what's super interesting about the year 2023 is this year was such a fascinating year in terms of ChatGPT and how it just took off in terms of like mainstream consumer adoption of a technology. It's really fascinating. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that, where it just almost literally overnight, people are talking about ChatGPT, and South Park is making episodes about ChatGPT, and it becomes part of the nomenclature. But I think that consumer adoption, I think ChatGPT in particular, whether or not that platform, is the long-term answer or not, is really irrelevant, because the impact ChatGPT has had on the industry is super fascinating. Because now we as consumers sort of understand AI in a way we never understood before now. But now it's sort of forcing the vendors and making enterprises that are hiring these vendors to do their technology initiatives, it's forcing them to focus on AI, because now it's top of mind for consumers and we as individuals understand it better. So now in our enterprise lives, we're looking for technologies that can leverage that sort of technology. So that's something that's super fascinating to think about. And AI is also fascinating because there's so much it can do that it can be overwhelming. And it's a good reminder that technology is changing a lot faster, and it's accelerating its pace of change much faster than any organization is going to be able to change. And so that chasm between humans' ability to change and technological change, that's going to continue to grow, especially with AI and analytics and some of this cool technology that's coming out. So again, back to the previous point, that's why change management becomes so important, is because now we're putting more strain than ever on organizations with this cool technology that will totally transform our business. But in the process of totally transforming our business, it will disrupt the people that are involved with it as well. So we just have to be mindful of the fact that, yes, again, there's a bright side. There's this state of utopia or nirvana we're trying to get to. But in the meantime, in that journey, what is it we're going to do with our people and with our organization to get us there? And so being selective and being deliberate about how are we going to use AI. And when we just define how we're going to use AI, how is it going to impact people's jobs? And then when we define how it's going to impact people's jobs, why are they going to freak out about it? And what are we going to do about it? And that's the way we have to think about it, is people will freak out about AI. They'll freak out about technological change and automation in general. Even though it could be a great thing for the organization, it's still, if it affects me personally in that way, it's going to be a threat to me. So that mainstream enterprise adoption of AI and analytics is another strong theme and trend that we're seeing in 2023 and certainly beyond. I think that'll be probably the big talking point for a lot of us in the space for years to come. Another thing that the ERP software vendors that are here today may want to plug their ears for this part of the conversation. They may not like this part, but there are a proliferation of alternatives to your traditional ERP systems. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I started in this space, you didn't really have a lot of options. You had, SAP and Oracle were around back then. Microsoft Dynamics hadn't really become a thing yet. Bond was still a thing, in the 90s. So you didn't have a lot of choices in the ERP space, and a lot of big organizations were going SAP, Oracle, Bond, and then there's sort of a drop off after that in terms of viable alternatives. And what you're seeing today is the total opposite. Now you've got SAP and Oracle, of course, you've got Microsoft, you've got Epicor, Infor, IFS, all who are here today. You've got other lesser known software vendors. There's a company called Priority Software out of Israel. I know they have some people here today. that have joined us from Israel. A lot of different companies, Workday, for example, on the human capital side, and Salesforce on the CRM side. A lot of these niche players that have at one point were startup competitors, or 20 years ago, they didn't exist. And now they've become big players in the space. And that the landscape, I think, will continue to change. And what it's doing is it's creating a lot of options for customers now. They don't have to go with the incumbent monolithic, old school type of ERP systems. They could, I mean, plenty of them still are, but there's a lot of other options now that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive too. It might be that you have a core ERP system, and then you've got other systems to do other things that your ERP system can't do very well. And you didn't really have that option before. You just sort of had to deal with it. You had to customize or do some sort of unpleasant bolt-on or whatever the case may be. So a lot of different options that organizations have now that they didn't have before. And so that proliferation of alternatives gives us a lot more different paths we can go down. And it makes digital strategy and planning even more important, because now we've got to be very deliberate about how we're deploying technologies. And even if we are, by the way, going to deploy an ERP system, for example, I'll pick on Epicor because they're here today. Where's Epicor? Right here. There's a couple of people from Epicor here, and Kristen in the back here. So let's just say you decide you're going to shortlist Epicor. What does that mean? I mean, Epicor has multiple products. How do we know which Epicor product is the right one? You look at like SAP. Even SAP, when I started in the space, I did a lot of SAP consulting because I worked at one of the big five at the time, big five consulting firms, and we focused on SAP. So when I was at that company, SAP was sort of its own homegrown, integrated system. But SAP has shifted its strategy now, and they went out and acquired a bunch of different other software companies like SuccessFactors and Ariba and Concur, Business Objects, et cetera, et cetera. So they become like a best of breed provider in one vendor. And so a lot of the vendors are recognizing this proliferation of alternatives, and they're acquiring other options and or developing multiple options. And so point being, the digital strategy, the planning, being deliberate about technology, finding the technology selectively that best fits your organization and your needs and your strategy, those are the things that are so critical to making your transformation more successful. The other thing to be aware of is that there are an increase in digital transformation failures. I see the trend ticking up pretty dramatically, and I'll be curious to hear from Marcus, who's up next after me. I know he'll touch on this as well, but some of the reasons why transformations are failing at a higher rate and are likely to continue to accelerate isn't because the technology is not good or because the technology can't do stuff. The technology can do more than we can ever imagine. And I have no doubt that the technology, for the most part, that's out there is pretty stable. It's proven in most cases. A lot of organizations are using these technologies successfully, but the journey to get there is becoming more and more complex and more difficult, partly because of what I described before, that chasm between technological change and human ability and organizational ability to change. That chasm is just going to continue to grow. And as that grows, the journey becomes bigger and harder and more complex and risky and costly and all that stuff. And our mindset needs to shift with that. And so in other words, we can't just drink the vendor Kool-Aid and say, okay, they're telling us we can do this in 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is. Maybe that's the right answer, but it's probably not. If a software vendor is telling you they can implement technology in a certain amount of time for a certain amount of effort, it's probably going to take you a lot more time than that, not because they're lying or because the technology can't do what they say it can do, although that is at times a risk that Marcus can opine on more than I probably can. That is a risk, but the bigger risk is that we as an organization can't change fast enough, and that becomes the critical path. How do we change our processes and our people to keep up with the technological change? That's what's driving a lot of failure. But the good news is if you address some of these blind spots and eliminate the blind spots, and you know what risk you're going into, that right there is a great starting point. Now you know what you're up against. Now you know that maybe it's not a 12-month implementation, maybe it's 18 months or 24 months. Or if it is a 12-month implementation, maybe the scope isn't as broad as we originally thought. And so being a little mindful and conservative, I'd say, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just being conservative and deliberate about how you plan for your projects is something that is going to help you make sure that you don't fall into that category of failures. And, I love Marcus, I love Taft Law, but I don't want you to have to hire him to go defend you or get involved in some sort of lawsuit. It's a lot cheaper to involve him or to hire companies like us and other speakers that are here. It's a lot cheaper to get that advice and that guidance up front than it is to go through a prolonged lawsuit. Another thing that's super fascinating about organizations and sort of the organizational psychology that happens with digital transformations is a lot of times organizations don't know what they don't know, which is okay. We don't expect that every organization is going to be an expert in transformation. That's why they hire companies like us and hire a lot of the people you're going to hear from here throughout the day and the conference. But what ends up happening is organizations tend to have this sort of a learned helplessness when they go through a transformation, meaning that they don't know what they don't know. And so they trust the first answer they get from a vendor or from any third party. And just to give you another, tying back my original opening story, tying it back to this point here, is that, you know, a real life example that's not technologically related, our son who broke his leg in 4 places, it was a really bad injury. And it was kind of a freak injury too, which is super weird. No contact, it was artificial turf, blah, blah, blah. I won't get into the details. But one thing is the doctor reset his leg and said, it should heal on its own. The body will do its thing and the bone will heal. In 4 months, he should be up and around and doing stuff again. And then we thought that seems a little odd because, you know, he just shattered his leg. We saw the x-rays and it was mangled. I mean, you could see it, his leg was mangled. And so we just thought it was weird. So we went to another doctor who said the opposite. They said, no, you need surgery like right away. That's not going to grow well. He's got growth plates that are exposed. He fractured his growth plate. They were concerned about that. And they were worried that there are shards of bone in there too. And they said, you absolutely need surgery. There's no way you should just let that heal on its own. So 2 very conflicting experts telling us 2 totally different things. And so we, as parents, had to take ownership of this. We had to dig deeper into both arguments and understand, first of all, the economic self-interest. That was one thing we learned very quickly. The surgeons, of course, were all saying, get surgery now. The doctors who are more into physical therapy and recovery type stuff were saying, don't worry about surgery, just get him recovering now that we've reduced or reset his leg. And so, you know, we had to do a lot of research. We ultimately decided to get surgery. And it turns out that was probably the right decision because they did find a bunch of bone shards that didn't show up in the x-rays and the scans. And that was causing some tendon issues, or they speculated it was causing some issues already, which is his toes were curled up and stuff. It was kind of gruesome, too much information there. But the reason I bring this all up is we had to do our own due diligence. And it's a lot like that with digital transformations. You, as people and leaders within your organizations and stewards of your resources and that sort of thing, you have to protect your own self-interest and you have to ask the tough questions. And, you know, it's fine to trust the experts. It's fine to bring in experts. You certainly want to listen to outside voices. But at some point, you've got to look at yourself, look at the information you're getting, and make decisions for yourself. We have one client who, it's a big steel company that's a client of ours, and we've been working with them for several years now. And they had a couple big projects happening at once. They were implementing Oracle and SAP in different parts of the organization. They were that big that they could get away with that sort of best of breed model. But one thing they found is that the technology work stream was moving a lot faster than the people in the process work stream. And they took the most dramatic actions that I've ever seen a client take, and that they said, all right, we're running at this run rate of X amount of dollars per month, and we were assuming it was going to be this duration. We're actually going to stretch that out now because we're finding that this duration was never realistic. We're spinning our wheels with the staffing that we've got right now under the assumption that we're going to get to that unrealistic timeline. And so what they did was they went to their big system integrator and said, we are cutting your staff. We're cutting it in half. We're going to stretch this out by, I can't even remember how much time they added to the project. Point being is they took total control of the project, and the system integrator did not like it because it worked against their self-interest. Now suddenly they had to cut their staff. They weren't making as much revenue right now. They had to spread that revenue out. So it conflicted with their self-interest, but the client knew best. They knew that this wasn't going to go well. They're wasting time and money trying to get to an unrealistic timeline. And so that's a great example and a good reminder that you as organizations need to protect your best interests, and you don't want to defer and completely outsource your project, which is what a lot of, especially big organizations, I'd say bigger organizations are more at risk of hiring a big consulting firm to come in and just do the whole thing for them. And that is super risky. It's going to cost you a ton of money, and it's probably not going to go well. I haven't seen that outsource model work in any situation in my career. And I've worked with a lot of different organizations over 25 years. And the organizations that are most successful, even if they don't make perfect decisions, even if they make bad decisions at times, the most successful organizations are the ones that make strong decisions based on their needs and what they think is best for their organization. And there's times where we disagree too. We'll tell them, we don't think that's a good idea. We think you should do something different. And sometimes they'll tell us, okay, we appreciate that, but we're going to do whatever. And that's what you have to do. And that's okay. Our feelings don't get hurt when a client doesn't listen to us. And the same should be true for the rest of the industry too. And it really doesn't matter what we think anyway. What matters is this is your organization and you need to protect your interests. So this is my Tony Robbins motivational attempt here to say, take control of your project. Don't let other people tell you how to run it. All this being said, strategy is more important than ever. Digital strategy has always been important, but defining a clear path to how you're going to get to that third stage of success and to that end state that you're trying to get to is more important than ever, especially because of all the things I've just talked about. The fact that technology is proliferating, technology is changing faster than we can imagine. Change is hard to begin with, but it's a lot harder now than it was before, and it's becoming harder over time. A lot of times, as a side note, a lot of times organizations will say to us, we're not worried about change management with our people because they're excited for the change. They know these old systems suck. They know that there's a better way they can be doing their jobs. And I don't disagree with that. Most organizations say that and they mean it, and it's true. The problem is that when you dig into and start deploying the changes and you start disrupting people's lives, suddenly it's not so fun. Suddenly I'm not so excited about the change. You start talking about AI or whatever and how it's going to automate 50% of my job. Sounds good in theory. I can get behind why you'd want to automate 50% of my job, but wait, what's going to happen to my 50% of my job? You're going to automate it. Do I still have a job? What am I going to do with that 50% of the time? What about that value I provided the organization of working through all these bad systems? That's the pride I take in my job, and now you're taking that away from me. That's the sort of thing you have to think about. And so all these dimensions that we're talking about mean that strategy is more important than ever. Digital strategy will always be important, and will continue to be more important. And I always tell organizations too that if you can go slow at the beginning, that's when you want to go slow. When you're planning, when you're doing your strategy, you don't want to get into analysis paralysis. That there's a difference between analysis paralysis and spinning your wheels and just being stuck versus let's go slow and let's do this at a measured pace to have a really solid plan. Let's re-engineer our processes and define our roadmap and figure out how we're going to integrate the systems, figure out how we're going to resource the project. Let's do that part slow so that later we can speed up. And if you do that, it may feel like you're going slower and you are falling behind against what you could be doing in that early stage. But long-term, you will complete your project faster and more successfully if you take that time up front to define the strategy, the roadmap, do the project planning. Those organizations that take the time to do that, again, they fall behind because they aren't starting the project right away. And the vendor's telling you, by the way, vendors will typically tell you need to start now. We're going to get our team out there on Monday. We're going to start designing and building stuff. It's going to be great. We can't wait another week. We can't wait another month because then we'll fall behind. That's not true. You need to fall behind early on to take that time to get it right. And then you can speed things up later. And it's going to go a lot faster if you have your ducks in a row and you have all that figured out. By the way, too, back to my previous point about taking ownership of the project, the more time you take to define a strategy and plan, the more likely it is you're going to take ownership and have control of your project. It's going to be less likely that you either intentionally give up control to your vendor or you unintentionally cede control to your software vendor or your system integrator. So the more time you take doing this, there's a lot of secondary benefits as well to make your project more successful. Accountability and risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is something that's always been important, but I think now organizations are finally starting to recognize that it is very important to talk about risk. And I know Marcus will touch on that in the next session from a legal perspective, some of the risks to be aware of and to watch for and be mindful of. But I'll summarize this real quickly in the interest of time by saying that risk mitigation and risk management is something you want to do from day one. And if you're going into a project without a risk assessment or a risk log that's empty, something's not right. There are risks, absolutely. In every single project in here, I guarantee you there are risks with your project. I'm not saying you should stop your project and cancel it and just don't do it. I'm saying there's a risk there. You just don't know what it is or no one's said anything about it yet. And we've got to figure out now how to address it. Problem with digital transformations too is that risks oftentimes aren't obvious up front and they percolate and they just sort of sit there under the surface until you get closer to go live. And the closer you get to go live, the more the stuff starts to bubble up. And by the time the stuff bubbles up, it's too late. That stuff's been brewing for months or years leading up to that point. And that's why a lot of times organizations feel like they just got sideswiped or they just got derailed on their project overnight. It didn't happen overnight. That stuff was percolating over time. So that's why you want to identify those risks early on and start attacking the risk and being deliberate about it. Another 80s reference, for those of you that grew up in the 80s, you remember the whack-a-mole game where you had to hit the mole and then the next one pops up, you hit that one, another one pops up and you hit as many as you can. That's risk mitigation, and that's a digital transformation. Those are your risks right there, the moles that keep popping up, and you just got to keep beating them down. And might not be quite as fun as whack-a-mole, but that is something you need to do in a digital transformation to be successful. If there's one biased thing I'll say here in today's conversation, it's that I think the acceleration of the tech agnostic movement is something that's going to continue to accelerate. And I don't just say that in a self-serving way, although I'll be honest, there is a self-serving piece of why I'm saying this. But I will say, even if it's not third stage, I will say that the tech agnostic movement is going to become more and more powerful and more important to this industry, because you need people that don't have economic interests that conflict with your own. And that's the way the whole industry has been built around competing and conflicting self-interest. And that's okay. That's just the way it is, right? If a software industry wants to sell software, they need to have their marketing messaging down. They need to build an entire ecosystem that supports that sales message. They need to hire consultants that focus just on their software and get commissioned to sell their software. They need to pay for industry analysts to talk about how great their software is. That's the way you sell software. So that's not going to change too, by the way, whether you like it or not, it's not going to change. So let's not worry about changing that. Let's figure out what we're going to do about it. How are we going to add a dose of reality and objectivity to our project? And one way to do that is look to voices that don't have a vested self-interest that conflicts with yours. We only make money from our services from our clients. We don't make money from software vendors. And that's a really important part of our business model. And that tech agnostic mindset, I think, will become more and more important, not just for us, but for other organizations going forward. And I know several of the speakers here today, most of the speakers here today are tech agnostic and may touch on that as well. So I'll step out of the way here. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to put a bow on all this and sort of give you a capstone here, this is a digital strategy roadmap that we have a lot more detail behind this, but this is a summary of it. Feel free to take pictures and I'll send it to you. We're pretty open with our general methodologies because it's not rocket science. Despite the third stage metaphor that I talked about before, digital transformations are not rocket science. They don't need to be that complicated. They just need a focus on the right things. And this digital strategy roadmap really hones in on the major threads that are really important. And certainly enterprise applications here are very important. So going and finding the right technology, that's important. Having the right solution architecture from a technical perspective and an infrastructure perspective is important. Making sure you've got all the technological stuff figured out, how data is going to work and how data is going to flow, how processes are going to flow, how integration is going to work, what types of technologies you'll tie together, all that stuff. This is all important, but the most important part of a project is going to be these areas here, your overall business process management and your organizational change. And even backing up even further, if I were to simplify it in one thing that is most important, is to make sure that this roadmap that you define for your organization fits who you are today and who you're trying to be in the future. And that will look very different than anyone else you ask in this room. And it should look different. Not to say you should recreate the wheel, not to say you should over-engineer your project, but to say that the way you use technologies, the way you deploy changes, the way you change your culture, the way you change your people, that should be a lot different than what most organizations do. You might use a lot of the same tools and best practices, but it should, for the most part, look different. So create a digital strategy that fits your style and your business and your needs and your priorities and objectives. And yes, you can listen to the tech providers that'll tell you all about all the great bells and whistles that are out there and the great options that are out there. Certainly take that into advisement. But at the end of the day, it's like a puzzle. You've got to put together the pieces of the puzzle that make sense for your organization. And by the way, who you are today is really important. A lot of times in this industry, we tend to say, don't worry about today because you're changing. That doesn't matter. It's old school. You're going to the future. Well, you do have to understand today because your entire organization was built to get to where you are today. And where you are today and where you're starting from looks different from where other organizations are starting. You have to think about it too, by the way, is this digital strategy for us? Is this going to be an incremental change? Like, are we just going to do some minor low risk, but maybe high ROI types of changes? Are we going to do more of a quantum leap where we're going to just double down on technology and we're going to be really aggressive about how we go through the transformation? Those are two totally different strategies and roadmaps, and neither one, by the way, is right or wrong. So that's really the theme of where I want to cover today. And hopefully what you'll take away is not fear, but just a realistic understanding and sort of taking the blinders off a little bit in terms of understanding what the risks are. And hopefully that makes you feel empowered. Like, now I know what the risks are. Now I can go back to my project and to my organization, to my transformation team. And now I can go in with the confidence, knowing that I know what the risks are. I know where I need to focus my time and effort. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but hopefully we get you on the right track to the way you think about your transformations.